Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you today, and fascinating to hear the Minister speak there. I'm going to, I think, stay on the same topic, but look at it a little bit through a business lens. And as Michael just said, I'm Accenture's Chief Strategy Officer, which means I'm on our Global Executive Committee and responsible for the direction of the company and all of our investments. And to give you a little bit of a flavor, we're a 430,000 person company now, operating in more than 100 countries with offices in more than 50-something countries. So we look at this topic at a very personal level for our business as well, to understand. So by way of setting a little bit of context, the outside world, I think, we talk about a low growth environment in the OECD countries. And you'll hear people talk about globalization 2.0 or even deglobalization. And that's a little bit some of the context that surrounds us. And indeed, if you look at some of the stats, global trade in goods between 2003 and 2007 grew by 7%. In the last year, 2016, it grew by 1.3%. The equivalent figure for services, global trade in services, was 0.1% growth. Those are pretty low levels of growth. And foreign direct investment has still not yet recovered to the levels of pre-crisis that we saw. So that's investment flows between countries. Now, does it matter? I mean, you could say, look, we're in the second longest bull run ever, or pretty much since the Great Recession in the 1930s, the Depression. But actually, we think it does matter. And it matters for several reasons. One is, if you look at the OECD data on the share of global trade in GDP, if that grows by 1%, then that drops through to between a 0.9 and a 3% growth in income levels of people. And of course, it impacts the poorest people the most. And it's probably not an accident that the number of people in poverty since 1990 to now has been halved to below now a billion people in the world, at exactly the moment that the world's poorest countries opened up their economies to be on a more open trade type stance than they had been in the past. And of course, China is the exemplar on this, with 680 million people taken out of poverty since 1990. And so we think that this topic here around what's going on around globalization 2.0, or whatever you want to call it, really does matter. And from the Accenture point of view, we serve multinational companies. And we're a big company ourselves, and we serve multinational companies. And we look at the world of business and global trade and how it operates underpinned by a digital fabric that allows trade to actually happen with data flows and the movement of services and products in the IT sphere that enable much of what we talk about in the global economy. And what we have found is a couple of trends that I'd like to sort of focus in on here. So the first one that we've talked about here is around, well, what are governments actually doing? And so in the G20 countries, since 2010 to 2016, we've seen a quadrupling in measures that restrict trade. A quadrupling. So now there are 1,200 measures from the G20 countries that restrict trade. Now, national legislations, and I think the Minister spoke extremely eloquently around the democratic legitimacy of choices that countries make, grapple with tough issues like terrorism, cybercrime, inequality in the economy. Those are very legitimate issues that they grapple with. But I think sometimes it worries us when we look at the specific policies being put out there, not just the Chinese cybersecurity law, Michael, that you referred to, is that those policies sometimes seem to get jumbled up a little bit with identity politics and populist politics. And so they sort of taken in the same breath. And what we've seen here is an increase in the share of populist parties in Europe. It has doubled since the 1960s, and the number of seats in the European Parliament have gone from 3.8 to 12.8% in recent times of the seats given to populist parties. And so that's something to think about. So this is, if you like, the trend in the macro context. But on the flip side, and the Minister again spoke about this, is we have the world of these giant digital platforms, Facebook with 2 billion consumers, WeChat in China with billions of consumers, conducting commerce at a level that never ever seen before. And you'll hear about web scale and hyperscale and infinite scale and these services that provide incredible convenience to consumers. And indeed they've created tremendous consumer utility that consumers jump on. The reason Amazon is successful is not just because Jeff Bezos is brilliant, which he is, but because they've created something that's so convenient and helpful for people. And people vote for it, they like it. And so you have these two trends, one around this sort of fragmentation of politics perhaps, and the other one around these big massive data flows underpinning the digital platforms that we see underpinning big chunks of the economy. And when certain heads of state talk about the bull market and how fantastic the growth in the share prices are underpinned by earnings, what they don't often tell you is that those earnings have mainly come in a fairly concentrated a small number of massive digital companies that have driven a lot of the effects that we see. So what we see here is a collision actually between two different trends. You have and these trends are led by sets of people who speak completely different languages. So you have the world of politicians and people designing frameworks for markets, and then you have the folks who are generally coming from a software engineering background building these digital platforms, speaking really in quite a different language. And so, we heard about the libertarian view of the internet, which certainly is on the right-hand side, and then perhaps, how we inject liberal values in the internet, although that, of course, is coming from a UK minister, and I wouldn't assume for one second that would be the position of many other governments around the world in terms of how they think they want their internet or their version of the internet to be. So, as I said at the beginning, Accenture's perspective on this is coming at it from the world of business and saying, well, what really is going on here? So we went and spoke to a group of people in business. We spoke to 400 CIOs and CTOs of big corporations who, of course, they're not just the big digital platforms, although those companies are in there, but I'm talking about the wider companies in the global economy from 8 different countries. So, of course, you'd expect the US, the UK, Japan, China, South Korea, Germany, so big countries. And those are the folks that we spoke to say, okay, what are you seeing? Like, what are you already seeing as a result of, let me call it this economic nationalism or some of these deglobalization policies? And what they're seeing is 88% confirm that this fragmentation is actually a problem for their company over the next 3 years. They perceive it as a problem. 86% feel that their existing IT strategies, their IT systems architectures are not fit for purpose, perhaps, for this new environment and are vulnerable. 91% predict an increase in IT costs overall. They're going to have to pay more to operate and run the IT that they need to serve their company. And of course that shows up in the form of access to talent, where you get your data center capability from. Those things look like they're going to be costing them more. And 2/3 of the companies are already feeling those increased costs. So that's already in the economic system today. The statistic I think that surprised me the most was that 74% stated explicitly that they would expect to exit or delay or abandon a new market entry as a result of this fragmentation. And in the UK, the number is 84%. As a sidebar, pretty much all the numbers I quoted you, the UK equivalent number was higher as a percentage. And so what does that mean? Well, if strategic trade has contributed to increases in wealth, particularly for poorer people, then this probably matters. And again, I'll point you at a report that I thought was very interesting from Ray Dalio, the head of Bridgewater, the other day, about the inequality effects. Because of course, as someone who sits there thinking about what is the effect of digital on the economy, you have to answer the question about inequality. And what you'll find is that there's a huge polarization between the top 40% and the bottom 60% of people. And the issue is when you pump more cash into the top 40%, or essentially when you put more money with richer people, they don't necessarily spend more because they have a lot already. When you put a little incremental money to poorer people, they immediately spend more on precisely the goods that drive global trade. And that's an interesting insight to think about for policymakers as they think about policies that affect how business works. So what are we actually seeing then beyond this? So these data flows are underpinning a whole range of engines of growth in the economy. And the minister alluded to some of them. The Internet of Things means that you can connect devices and offer new services. Cloud services means that you can access services remotely from anywhere at a very low cost. In fact, you can access innovation that billions have been spent on by a Google or a Facebook, and you can access it super cheaply off a cloud service, no matter if you're a tiny startup or an independent entrepreneur. The world of analytics and personalization, again, could be used for an amazing force for good, of tailoring services to a way that people really want, that suits what they actually desire and need, rather than the broad brush. I mean, I don't know how many of you remember, but marketing leaflets stuffed in the mail, arriving in your home, randomly. That world is completely changing. So these tools of the modern era are very valuable, but they're underpinned by data flows, and those data flows are being disrupted today. There are obstacles arising for them. And so, when we ask these CIOs and CTOs to say, what does this make you think about your digital strategy, what you're doing in your company, what we found is that 54% that using cloud services was becoming harder. That's 62% in the UK. 54% said that using cross-border analytics services was also becoming harder, and that's 70% in the UK. And that digital transformation, which again is a little bit, I find a funny phrase, but essentially what does it mean? It means, how do I deliver incredible business results in an era that is digital? How do I do that? How do I use digital techniques and methods and innovation to improve my company, improve my services? Again, a large portion are saying that they see that is getting harder in the world of regulations and rules and obstacles that they face, that they have to deal with today. And again, when you look inside the company, what struck me a little bit were the statistics that they were quoting about which functions in the companies are most impacted by these rules today. So sales and marketing, research and development are the most impacted groups within companies today, which of course think about where a lot of innovation needs to come from. But I was also surprised that even manufacturing was up there as one of the functions that would be most heavily impacted. Now, of course, companies don't stand still. They get on and they do things, and in fact, they already are. And so one of the things that we see companies do is resort to the use of automation of work. Now, it is ironic that oftentimes legislation that's designed for job protection stimulates accelerated job automation. And that is indeed what we've seen over a long period of time in the manufacturing sector. What a lot of these modern IT technologies enable is the same effects to happen in the white-collar types of roles and jobs as well. And so companies, when they're finding it hard to ship talent around, sometimes resort to making that need go away through the use of automation. And that is 2/3 of companies overall said that they were down that road, 76% of companies in the UK. Just over 50% already restructuring their global IT architectures, so their data centers, where they put, where the data residency is, and how they manage that. And that's 62% of companies in the UK. 20% of the companies said they've already had this subject, a whole board meeting focused on this subject. So that means at the highest level of their business, they're very fixated on this. And 80% of the companies said they've had several strategic planning sessions on this already. So I've painted a world where you have these two big trends, if you like, that bump into one another. Companies are already moving and doing things. But what is it that we think that they really are likely to need to do going forward? And we boil it down to four topics. So the first one is the strategy process itself. Actually, I've always been a little bit bemused at how the investment community, until relatively recently, and I really mean in the last 3 or 4 years, the investment community has never really looked at technology as a major factor in deciding about an investment. The private equity community right now are now making it a prerequisite. Like, what is the impact of technology on this company? Because people now really see that this digital effects are pervasive. They affect basically every single sector. But I think companies need to go from, how will technology affect the company, to how will the rules about technology affect the company. That is a piece of the strategic planning process that needs to be adjusted. And of course, it will affect things like CapEx plans that companies make, the ventures and acquisitions that they would strike, and phasing and prioritizations of moves that a company makes on its digital journey. How will that evolve over time? So that's the part one here, is around how do I have agility baked into my strategic planning process. The second one is around local advantage. And for anyone here in the room who grew up in the resources industries, you're very familiar with the concept of local content. That, of course, applies here as well. To drive digital innovation in a company, to take advantage of digital, you have to work with an ecosystem. No one company has the monopoly on innovation. You have to work with an ecosystem of partnerships, big and small, local partnerships, local technology players, local digital players, as part of a company strategy, we think will become ever more important. Plugging into, most of our clients, big companies, they do work with local regulators and local policymakers, but the degree to which they work on things like the National Innovation Program of a country, I think there's a lot more that companies can do in that space, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. And again, when people talk about the big bad multinationals, of course, and I'm speaking very personally as an Accenture, which is a multinational company. Accenture India has more than 100,000 people, and our Accenture India leadership and the Accenture India folks are just as Indian as any local Indian technology company. And I think a job of every multinational is to be local where it resides in its individual countries. The third part is a little bit around actually understanding the data flows that are driving management and decision making and management investment decisions, and understanding how confidentiality rules and residency rules are going to affect those data flows. And actually, that's not so simple as it sounds, because you have to think forward in terms of what's the data I'm going to use in the future to improve my business. And if you look at the signal hubs that companies are creating today to build up incredible predictive insight into what consumers want and need in near real time, that is a major data flow exercise. And so understanding those data flows and then de-risking them and working to understand which policy rules are most impactful and how to manage with that will become a key part of risk assessment and risk monitoring or enterprise risk in the business going forward. And then the fourth one here is, of course, technology itself offers some of the solutions. And so I mentioned automation and augmentation of the workforce using artificial intelligence techniques. Those are for sure part of the story. Cloud services, of course, are part of the story. Much innovation that's happening today is being baked either through open source or proprietary techniques into the cloud stacks. And companies, one of the success factors of companies in the future will be their ability to use and leverage that. Other things like blockchain and 3D printing are in the same zone. Just because I have to keep the manufacturing blueprints in one place doesn't mean I can't manufacture it somewhere else. And those are all parts of, I think, how this story will evolve. So, in summary, digital and the innovation that goes with it underpins growth in the global economy. So therefore, digital fragmentation is a big deal, and it's actually already happening. This is not a theoretical thing. Well, the evidence is it's already happening today. It is indeed impeding on innovation and growth in the economy. When I talk to my clients in business, of course, we ask them to make sure they think about these things and prepare their companies as best as they can. But from a policymaker's point of view, of course, there could be advantage in designing rules that advantage your local corporations and help them in terms of taking advantage of these digital data flows and the innovation. So that's actually all I had, Michael, in terms of prepared comments. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. A great piece of work. Some fascinating things that come out of that. I want to touch on one of the numbers first. The 74% of respondents who said they were going to exit or delay a market. That's quite an alarming number, isn't it?
It is a big number. Of course, it's very hard to know, what the control experiment is.
Yeah.
But it was very much asked in the context of these trends. And I think this is not a secret, but when there is uncertainty in the world, business delays decisions. That's how that's as a business leader, that's what you have to do. If you're unsure if a move is a good move, then you don't make it. And unfortunately, delaying decisions means delaying investment, and delaying investment means delaying growth. And so, yes, I think it is alarming.
You mentioned a bit later on about de-risking data, and again, that's interesting because it's not just looking at legislation that's coming down the road, it's also looking at consumer trends and how one might inform regulation before it's put in place or adapt your business model to it. How does business go about that? Where does it sit? Does it sit in CIO? Does it sit in legal?
I think this one is a difficult question, and actually a challenge that I give a lot of my clients is, if you look at boards of companies, they compose the people primarily from a financial background. Their obligation is fiduciary and very careful financial steering of a company. The problem with this whole digital thing is it turns out that technology is a really big deal. And not a lot of very technology literate people sitting on boards, let alone something deep like cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And so actually the answer is you need more senior technologists in boards, involved in helping steer organizations. I don't think the answer is immediately jump to CIOs, because if you ask yourself, what have we asked CIOs to do in the last 20 years? The answer is cut costs, offshore, outsource, cut costs. And so actually they've become more, there's a broad brush, that you often end up with a contract management logic to the CIO function rather than a technologist and what can technology do for the business logic. Although that, of course, is the amazing opportunity for CIOs today.
my experience in the past, especially with Reuters and Thomson Reuters, where technology was a key part of the business, one of the challenges was getting the technologists to understand the business, because pure technology is a beautiful thing, but doesn't necessarily apply to consumer trends or, in particular, complex legal environments. So is there a piece of work to be done there as well?
I mean, no doubt. I mean, what you made me think about, Michael, when you said that is, if you think about all these small companies that are busy disrupting industry after industry, and I mean it's in every sector, it's not just fintech, it's health tech, it's ed tech, it's insure tech, I mean that's out there. The way they do it is they start actually with a business issue, a customer pain point that they understand deeply, and then they say, how can I use all this modern technology to solve that problem? That exactly, of course, is the logic that corporations need to also use. And so I think that would encourage more technologist-minded people to say, actually, what are the business issues I'm trying to solve and deal with? That I can use technology for. Yeah. So, yeah.
Very happy to bring in the audience now, please. Immediately. First question over there. If we could take the mic around to the gentleman in the check shirt. We'll come down there.
Hi, it's Tim Rush, KPMG. Probably just following on your one about de-risking data. Do you think there's going to be slightly self-regulation? In the past, it's been every single company have gathered every single data possible on people. But what they're now struggling, especially the banks, is how do I use this properly because they've got too much data? Isn't it going to be a stage where people are going to get much more refined data of what they need, and therefore with the GDPR and everything else, there's going to be an element of self-regulation because you're not going to have so much?
I think that's a very tough question. I mean, if you think about the behavior of companies, they come across a broad spectrum, often reflecting the culture of the leadership, the founders, and so on. So you have, I mean, if you go to the West Coast in the States, you'll find companies there who are much, much more fearful about their competition than they are about regulators and politicians. And that can drive their behaviors. But then I can find you other examples of companies who are much more concerned with the impact of, a public revulsion to some acts of misuse of data. And so the maturity around, a code of business ethics in companies is not a consistent thing. How to handle data responsibly is not, I think, something that you can have a blanket rule that says it applies equally everywhere. Now, the banks obviously have been bashed very heavily since the financial crisis. They've spent a fortune on compliance, tens of thousands of people in one bank with a job around compliance. And so that mindset could become much more pervasive, but that isn't necessarily true in any number of other businesses I could refer to. So I think you're going to see a full spectrum there.
Okay. There's a question down there, just at the back. Please, Tiara.
Hi, Omar. I'm Sri Kumar from ArcelorMittal. So you talked about the ecosystem and platforms for big companies to thrive in this digital disruption. And you also mentioned that the smaller companies who are coming up with solving particular problem, they will play a big role in the ecosystem. So how a large organization can build this partnership with these smaller companies? I mean, of course, we are seeing nowadays some of this like GE or Saudi Aramco, they are also starting up their own venture capital firm to, let's say, promote this type of companies, but not everybody is doing that. So what's the approach big companies should take, basically?
So now you're talking about my day job. So I'm obsessed with that question because I really mean what I said, is innovation comes from the bottom of a technology maturity S-curve, not the top. Corporates all inhabit the top because our cost of capital is too low to afford the risks of failure that you get with innovation. So all the innovation is actually happening at the bottom of the S-curve. The problem is corporates are pretty useless at working with small companies because the CEO goes to Silicon Valley on a digital safari, meets a company and goes, wow, you're brilliant, then asks the CPO to go and do something with them, and the chief procurement officer takes 60 days to sign a non-disclosure agreement, by which time the company's dead. So figuring out that match is a non-trivial thing. And as you say, there are all sorts of experiments out there. There are corporate incubators, corporate VCs, corporate accelerators. Generally, they don't work that well. There are a couple of examples. So what do we think? I think multiple things have to happen for a company to succeed. One is you need to accept, and corporations are not good at this, that you're not good at everything. Corporations find it very difficult to, you've got to get rid of the not invented here syndrome. And so that means buying little companies and not killing them. And letting them teach you and letting their culture infuse you. That means developing a gene for partnering, which again, big companies were like, I'm the big company, you're going to follow my rules. Well, maybe. But that's probably not the best way to get the best insights and the best innovation. And then thirdly, in Accenture, we talk about an innovation architecture, which is how do you create units or organizational nodes in the business who are investing at appropriate levels for the market maturity of a given innovation. So if the thing might be 10 years out, then invest little. If the thing is 3 years out, then invest more. And if the thing is at scale today, then invest masses. And how you design that in the architecture of the company is, I think, a very interesting thing to do.
Yeah, we've seen many examples of big companies taking over small innovative companies and just squeezing the innovation out of them because they have to comply with all the internal rules.
There are tons of examples. I mean, not only in the tech space. If you look at how the oil majors handled fracking in the US, they often went and bought fracking experts and then made no money. And the reason is they brought their financial policy, their HR policy, their compliance rules, and imposed them on these small companies which were not designed, it was not fit for purpose for that market. And so how to adjust is not trivial.
Yeah. Next question from the audience, please. I'd like to turn now to the regulatory environment. Do businesses accept there's a need for regulation to catch up with technology?
I think all businesses accept that a free-for-all market is probably not wise. In fact, every market is circumscribed by some rules, and so therefore regulation is necessary, yes. The issue is in human history, and I don't see this changing at all, is the regulation will always lag the technology.
Yes.
And so how you manage that latency in time is not trivial.
Did you get a sense from, not just from this survey, but from your clients, that business is as engaged as it should be with policymakers to have input into regulation?
Again, to the gentleman's question over here, I mean, I do think that is on a spectrum of industries. Like, so the financial services sectors, post what happened in 2008, have been super involved in shaping policy, whether you like it or not, in countries around the world. The technology giants on the right-hand side of my picture here probably didn't grow up with that same heritage and mindset. And in fact, until relatively recently, they've been very popular with consumers, and therefore politicians not that interested. Yeah. There's a risk right now for them, I think a very real and present danger, is that they've suddenly become less popular and have to show up a lot more. And if you look at the lobbying expenditure of the 4 biggest digital companies in Washington, D.C. in the last year or two, you'll find that it's at the top of the league table in terms of being more connected with what's going on Capitol Hill.
Are you optimistic, though, that businesses can navigate this path? Because the transformation of technology itself over the last decade or more has been extraordinary. And some businesses have succeeded, some haven't. Are they better prepared? Can they navigate it?
I mean, I'm convinced the answer is yes. I think businesses obviously just have to remember the basic mantra of, what's the public good here? What's the public interest case? What's the public interest case that we can be part of? And of course, as long as businesses are doing things that are good for consumers, then it's good. And if they're doing things that bring investment, bring innovation, drive growth, then there is a public interest case. And so I think businesses just need to be much more explicit about the things that can augment that public interest case versus detract from it, and make that part of their day job. And I do think that most mature businesses see that as the way to go here. And of course, there is a win-win for policymakers that create a vibrant business environment will attract more investment and more growth, which of course is good for their citizens. And so,
thank you very much. We have to leave it there because we're going to take a break. Fantastic piece of work, really is fascinating. Some of those numbers, I do advise you to have a look at it. I believe it's going to trigger much more discussion going forward. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Omar Abbosh.
Thank you.